All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. So I'm excited about the seminar today. I was talking with Neil just before this, and I'm always excited because I actually get to learn a couple things about the data partners that we've had on our platform for a while, and there's always cool insights to learn. So before we jump into that, a couple of quick housekeeping items. One, as always, these seminars are recorded. We will send the recording to anyone after, so if you don't have to furiously take notes, you can definitely get access to the presentation after the fact. So we'll send an email in a day or two once that has been processed. We do have some upcoming seminars as well. So we have one with Rent Hub on April 24th, and we'll send an RSVP link in the follow-up here. And then the last thing would be a request. So we always are interested in working with researchers to actually present their research as well, using some of the data sets and the data partners that we have. So you can call this a mini call for speakers, but if you ever want to present as a researcher in one of these seminars with us, feel free to reply to our email as we follow up, because we'd love to get you on board and show some of the cool research being done with the data sets on our platform. So with that, I'm going to flip it over to Neil. So Neil's the CEO of LobbyingData. They've been partners with Dewey for a couple months now. I've always been impressed by their product, and we were just talking again before this, and it sounds like they're continuing to iterate and even make it better and better. So I'm excited to dive in and learn more about their product. So Neil, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Evan. So today we can go through some of the insights from LobbyingData.com, some of how we get our data, which is one of our top questions, and some of the ways that we've made it more sophisticated over time. So basically, I created LobbyingData.com to address the need for more transparent and accessible information into the world of lobbying. And first of all, just a general history lesson for everyone. The consensus around why it's even called lobbying comes from the president, Ulysses S. Grant. He was the 8th president, and allegedly he would have meetings with cigars and scotch and with interest groups in the lobby of the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. So that's the Willard Hotel right there. Is it still like that, like lobbying in general? Kind of, but what's really changed is the transparency element, of course. So in 1995, there was an act passed by Congress and signed by the president called the Lobbying Disclosure Act. So it made it mandatory for lobbyists to then disclose their activities on Capitol Hill, including how much money they were taking in by clients. So now we can take a look at the federal lobbying spend by 1999 to 2022. The reason why we're 2022 and not, the previous year 23 is because lobbying budgets are actually, they end up getting reconciled after the fact. It could actually end up being a year after the fact where the actual lobbying budget and lobbying spending will be reconciled, and you'll get the accurate numbers. So if you do look at this on like a different website, potentially Open Secrets, it's going to be a little bit different, but this is probably the most accurate number out there for 2022 in terms of spend. So obviously, since the act was passed in 1995, this data goes back to 1999 in our case, and not 95, because those are all paper copies. So we'd have to do some sort of a specialized algorithm to get the data between 95 and 99. But in any case, the spending has grown quite significantly, going to 4.8 billion, with around 13,000 federally registered lobbyists working across all different industries. In 99, it was about 1.6 billion, and that's adjusted for modern day cash. But I think whenever we see spending numbers, especially like in the news, it's difficult to actually see like what exactly that money is going to, what is that money? So to be very clear, we're tracking something with our data set that's very distinct from spending itself. A lot of people know that companies like Google, Pfizer, and Lockheed are all lobbying the government, but I think few know the extent to what exactly is happening. How much they're spending on it is just one question, but what we try to capture is what agencies they're targeting specifically in a very individual lobbying contract. And most importantly, why are they lobbying? So what bills are they going for? And most importantly, like what issues are they actually lobbying on in an individual contract? So when Apple or Facebook or Pfizer goes to a lobbyist and talks about their pain points with the government, what exactly are they looking to do with the lobbying? And that is exactly that's like the main consensus and point of our data set. So in the left over here, it's a lobbying contract by Tesla. That's exactly what it looks like. That's the form that the lobbyist fills out and submits to the government as a disclosure form on a quarterly basis. So we extract this data and make it as easy as possible to understand. Like just picture a CSV with a row that captures exactly that lobbying form. So this is from, I think, 2 summers ago, where Tesla had hired a well-known lobbying firm called Ty Ginsburg and Associates. They spent around $10,000 to advocate on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to exactly the Department of Transportation and other government agencies. So when you see a company like Tesla that's lobbying an agency, what they're doing is it could be a dinner, it could be with one of the agency members, it could just be as simple as an email, or that lobbyist who typically is like a lawyer, leveraging their contacts to get something out of the government. Typically, in reality, what this will be is, like, for example, Tesla has the new Cybertruck that came out, and maybe they're trying to get a new subsidy. And so they'll ask for, they'll email all their contacts at that government agency and hope to get one email from one of the regulatory lawyers at the agency that says, okay, yeah, you're okay to do this. We're gonna give you an R&D tax credit in Q4 of this year. And that email basically becomes like law that they can then follow and have as as something that they can run with and show to investors in the future. So it's very valuable. Just something as simple as an email from a regulatory lawyer at the government agency is just incredibly powerful. And that's what they're spending that $10,000 on. It's not always, having dinner and cigars, like I said earlier, at the Willard Hotel. It's as simple as an email, and that's what you're paying your money for, those connections. And this is a visual example of our data feed and how we capture it. So we use this to identify all the companies that have lobbied on a specific bill or law. And let's take, for example, in this case, and this is what a lot of our customers would do, take a look at a simple, like a bill. So I'm going to go back in time and look at the CHIPS Act. So we tracked every company lobbying on the bill in real time. And this is from about a year or 2 years ago. So we're just going on a retrospective basis, but this allowed our users to quickly identify any potential opportunities with firms that supported this bill, the CHIPS Act, such as which one could receive an advanced manufacturing tax credit and who sought to secure funding from that CHIPS Act. So this is basically to bolster the semiconductor industry in the US. So it hit Congress, and then afterwards we saw research firms on Wall Street publishing reports on the potential impact of the legislation on the semiconductor industry. With our data, you're actually able to tie this back to the individual company level rather than seeing like an aggregate trend happening like in the general research sphere. So that's really the whole goal of our data set. Like, don't even pay attention as much to the lobbying spending. It's easy to do so. What we want to do, and what I think the real alpha in our data set is, and that's why we're able to target institutional clients, is to actually look at the individual lobbying reports and see, is L3 Harris lobbying on the CHIPS Act? And then 3 months later, are they receiving a tax credit? And that's just a really great indicator for a company if they're able to actually effectively get that lobbying push and get as a result of the lobbying that tax credit. This one's a little bit more topical. So the TikTok ban, it's coming back, but this is in 2020. It all started around then. There was an act called the No TikTok on Government Devices Act. So that was introduced and later included a larger bill called the Consolidated, it was included in a larger bill called the Consolidated Appropriations Act. So it would just essentially ban TikTok on any federal government device, which was passed. TikTok ByteDance spent almost $5 million to retain a US-based lobbying firm. And we actually found that Meta platforms had lobbied on the bill as well, but in the opposite direction. The bill was passed, and it's led to the more recent Restrict Act, and then subsequently, more recently, more calls to ban TikTok. It's very controversial and widely informally known as that TikTok ban. That's the Restrict Act. So at the time, we monitored lobbying reports just after the bill's introduction in March of that year, and found that since the bill was introduced, at least 30 companies sought lobbying representation to advocate on the issues concerning the Restrict Act. It's difficult to tell if it's for or against, but when it comes to ByteDance themselves lobbying on the Restrict Act, you can probably, guess that it's going to be against some sort of regulation against this company. But then when you see a company like Meta or another advertising company that is potentially a competitor to TikTok, that's really where like the interesting insights you can start drawing from it. And then, one company that we did see in this bunch that had lobbied on the Restrict Act was a Chinese-owned autonomous car company, that was lobbying. So we don't know the direction, but we can probably make a good guess as to what their position on the Restrict Act is. So now let's take a look at another paper that was done. It's not been published yet, but we look at a paper from one of our partners, which sought to identify the relationship between lobby spending generally and the odds of a bill passing in Congress. As you can see, it's quite a difference here. It's difficult to actually say because there are so many different factors that go into a politician's decision to vote for or against a bill. So I'm not saying that lobbying is like the end all be all, and of course there are so many different factors that go into play. But that hypothesis there is, there is no relationship between lobbying spending and bill passage. So we looked at 2.5 million lobbying reports over 81,000 bills from 1999 to 2022. And it showed a very significant relationship between the two, which is, of course, not surprising. But what is interesting, and this is the big takeaway here, is that they found that the effect was almost equal between a Democrat majority Congress and a Republican majority Congress. So almost an equal effect relationship between, that lobbying spend and odds of a bill passing Congress. So for each $1 million increase in lobbying spending, regardless of the congressional party, that is associated with a 29% increase in the likelihood of a bill's passage, just according to this paper. And of course, there are many other other factors that go into play with a bill passing Congress. Ultimately inherent to a study like this are limitations and bias, just a disclaimer on that one. But let's take a look at COVID PPE. So this is a really interesting one. There was another paper done on this. It took a look at the CARES Act funding in government contracts specifically. So, at that time in 2020, I'm sure many of you listening now may have known like a small business or, potentially a larger business that received funding due to having been shut down, throughout COVID. So this research tells that story about like, if you lobbied the government during the COVID CARES Act time, were you more or less likely to receive funding from in the form of government grants? So if a company had lobbied, how much more money would they receive from government contracts? And the results are, as you can see, pretty enormous. The model they use here tells us that for every $1 spent on lobbying on a particular bill during this time period, they would receive a little more than $3 of money back in terms of a more generous government contract. So that's about 326% return on investment with engaging from lobbyists. We have another partner that's working on more present day research on this, just looking at government contracts and return on investment. But just based off the COVID time period, it's pretty interesting to see. And, this is more recent. So there's a new lobbying ETF that was launched, and it's just generally built off that notion that political capital is an overlooked intangible asset that could produce excess stock returns. And to summarize, where we get it from, how it happens, why we even do this, we've tracked lobbying for about 3 or 4 years now. It's something that I've just been personally passionate in sharing with the world and sharing, exactly who is lobbying the government and why. So we track that lobbying, and we tell our clients, which are mostly institutional investors, as well as some trading firms more recently, that don't focus as much on the lobbying spending, because ultimately those numbers are not going to be as accurate as is reality. Tesla, in that one example that I said earlier, may have spent $10,000 in the contract, but it was most likely probably over 50,000 or probably more than 100,000. It's just very, very difficult, and these numbers are self-reported by lobbyists themselves. And there's obviously an incentive to not be as high as they actually are. However, the reasons, the bills, that's really where like the magic and the alpha is, in the lobbying, and that's why we have clients that are using this for trading, and they're using this for just all sorts of investment like theses. Especially one that's pretty interesting that I didn't talk about is looking at the individual lobbyists that are lobbying for on behalf of their clients. Like a lot of congressional former Congress people will actually join a lobbying firm and they'll have all these political connections. And so those will be the MVPs in a lobbying contract, and therefore, increase the probability that a company is going to get better results in that case. But yeah, I'll just leave it there at that. I'm happy to answer any other questions, and we can take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. That was great. And yeah, I think this is a good slide. I think there's a couple questions around like kind of the schema and the attributes available, which we'll get to in a second. Your last point was interesting. I was going to ask around like the challenges that come from this inherently being a self-reported report. And you covered the one that makes a ton of sense, where it's like, okay, the revenue report is or the amount, I guess, in that lobbying report is something that it makes sense to potentially be over or under, mostly underreported. But I think they probably have pretty strong compliance around, the entities involved in the direction of that lobbying. So you're right that I think in terms of capturing who is talking with who and in what capacity it's covered. But yeah, I would totally understand why there might not be the most accurate like kind of revenue or amount numbers associated with that. Any other challenges you imagine with working with this data, given that it's it's based on self-reported data, or is that kind of the biggest one?
That's a good question. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's definitely the biggest one. There really aren't too many other issues. The actual extraction of the data is the reason why this company exists, honestly, because
Yeah.
it's so difficult to understand. And I personally did my thesis on lobbying when I was doing my master's. So it takes a lot of time to work with, and that's the reason why we do this, and that's the reason why like institutional investors start adopting these kinds of new strategies, because not no one, it's been political capital as an asset has been completely overlooked, and lobbying, I think, is one of the best ways to measure that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know this isn't a new theme, but I've been hearing the term like regulatory capture a lot more in kind of these like tech and CEO circles of using it as a strategic advantage or a way to almost build a moat, especially if you're an early mover in a market. And so I'm sure in your data, I'm sure there's some fascinating stuff, especially around the AI space we're seeing now around some of these early movers in that space, trying to figure out how they can, maybe have a competitive advantage and restrict others from being able to move as quickly as they did. So is that kind of a common use case you've seen, as like, having people, different corporations trying to use this as a way to maybe suppress other competitors from having the similar advantages they did when they started?
Yeah, so this is that's a great question. So the newest use case for our data has been from lobbying firms themselves, who are a little bit more technical. We created a front end like tool for you to just search the database easily. And so they'll actually look at their competitors and see what they're lobbying for similar companies like FactSet's lobbying firm and Dun& Bradstreet's lobbying firm. They're similar companies, but they are actually looking at each other's lobbying and seeing what's going on, what kind of strategies are they placing, and then through those actual issues that you can read. So every single contract in our database is attached to basically a chunk of text that tells you exactly why the lobbying is occurring, and that's one of our biggest like alpha generating points. It's just that text is just so valuable, just like the reasons why, the bills that they're lobbying for. And we have another NLP field that tracks the bill to the congressional that text and extracts it to a congressional bill.
Well,
So, lobbyists that they read these and they can actually infer what kind of strategy that they have in place when it comes to seeing that. So it's not something that you or I are going to be able to do, to actually kind of
yeah,
transcribe that and just know this is what Dun and Bradstreet's lobbyists are doing. But it's a really valuable and new customer base that we've actually tapped into because of the fact that we track all the different competitors, all the different lobbying firm competitors to each other.
yeah, that's awesome. And you showed like a kind of a screenshot of what that report looks like. At a high level, can you maybe touch on some of the attributes that users can see in this data? Because one of the questions that came through was like, is there an attribute around like the political party? And so I would be interested to know kind of like what information you actually are able to grab from this is probably most commonly used.
Oh yes, yeah. So I'm seeing the questions now. My bad about that, but yeah, I can just go. So for the political party, we track the lobbying between a client and then the lobbying firm's client. So just picture like Apple or Facebook going to a lobbying firm on K Street in DC, which is kind of like where all the different lobbying firms are located. Um, and they're engaging in a transaction with each other. So the political parties, the only way you're able to track that is through the Congress at the time. So if you're like in the 118th Congress or the 117th Congress, all you would have to do is know if it's a Republican or Democrat majority. What a lot of people get wrong about lobbying is that you're actually going for a politician, which actually is true. You may in some cases do that, but most of the time you are going for a regulatory lawyer at like the FDA. That's like your
Mhm.
number one client. That's your number one like target as a lobbyist. You want to find a lawyer at the FDA or a lawyer at the DOT to get you that beautiful email that tells you that yes, you're okay to do something. That's the biggest ROI. It's not as like like political as people think it is. It just goes both ways as we saw with the different parties. No, lobbying is still very powerful, either, whether you're Democrat majority or Republican majority.
Mhm. And then I'm curious about just, the evolution of your product and what you're building. You mentioned some improvements around the subsidiary mapping. I'd love to hear about that. And just generally, I like to ask, like, where do you go from here? How do you continue to think about building out the product, adding new, qualities or features or improving the quality, anything like that?
Yeah, so subsidiary mapping is a feature that we came up with relatively recently out of a need to capture, companies like Dairy Queen, which are owned by Berkshire, to capture that in the lobbying to get that ticker symbol. So every single contract that we have in our data set is matched to a ticker symbol and CIK code if available. And the most difficult thing, I'm not sure if there's a service for this, but we might be launching it as an API because it's been so popular. We wouldn't have been able to win certain clients who are using this for trading without the subsidiary mapping system because a company like Dairy Queen or some subsidiary of like, or for example, Waymo, I think it's owned by Google. Those are things that they lobby as themselves rather than like Google and Berkshire. So that's incredibly difficult to do like as on a technical basis unless you have a data store that captures subsidiaries. So we have a pretty sophisticated algorithm now that captures based on the parent company and the subsidiary. I think I could probably do a whole talk on the actual technical side of that, but
Yeah.
we have a method that entails going to the 10K form of any of the public companies that we have and that have ever lobbied before. And there's a very small section in the 10K form. So this is a tip for all of you. Um, there's a small section in every 10K form that goes through like the ownership rates of different companies that the company owns. And so we tap into that section programmatically. And then we look at like if it's over a certain percent, we can count that as subsidiary, and then we'll basically do the whole mapping algorithm again on every single client in the lobbying database, look at the subsidiary as well as the parent company, and then we attribute that subsidiary company to the parent company using that 10K form, small section of subsidiaries. So it's actually a little bit brute force because we really haven't figured out a way to do it. But the difficulty is, since the data is self-reported, oftentimes, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, but the lobbying, the clients like Apple will be misspelled many times. So we have to do a
Hmm.
lot of like different algorithmic tricks around NLP to make sure that Apple is not the same thing as like an Apple farm in Minnesota or like an Apple totally different than the technology company. So we have context-based matching. Again, I could do a whole talk on the technical side of this, but we have context-based mapping based on the industry, based on the description and lobbying reports themselves as to what's
Yep.
going on. So it's going to be different than Apple versus Apple versus Apple. We
Yeah.
make sure that happens properly.
Yeah. And that's kind of the crux of the last question I see here around like I'm sure there's like, they have in that report kind of standard fields in a sense of, yeah, this is what you're supposed to fill out. But I'm sure the way that people fill out each of those fields is going to be drastically different depending on their goals and what they're trying to show. And you mentioned one of the largest challenges and why you guys exist is just the skill set you have built around digesting and kind of grabbing the information from those reports. You've talked about it a little bit more, but anything you want to, I'm always interested in the business element of what you guys have built. And so I'd love to hear about some of those other, maybe one or two stories about the challenges of the trying to grab the data from these reports.
Yeah, that's the whole crux of the actual business itself. It's like coming up with innovative ways to actually get that information out there. That's more important than anything else. Like like 99% of our clients just want to go for spending by like industry. And
Yeah.
I'm always telling you that, I tell all of our clients that the real alpha generating parts of the data set are in the reasons why a company lobbies.
Hmm.
And so if you can capture that, that is where like the value of the data set is, besides just like a visual graph that you put in a presentation on spending. Even the one I presented earlier today, I don't trust completely because it's just impossible, I think, to actually get a real number out of there. But what you can trust is why, and the bills that are lobbying, and specifically the outcomes of the bill, and that's really where our
Hmm.
value is. And that's why, we have a lot of clients just across every single type of hedge fund, including sovereign wealth funds that are using this and are very interested in using this for the bill, the combination of the bills to the actual ROI from the bills that are being lobbied for.
Right. Right. Interesting. And then I guess one last question for me. I'm curious about like, and you could just educate us on this, like the workflow, the lobbying workflow, where like presumably the lobbying happens and then a report is filled and then that report somehow becomes public and then you can grab it and do all your work to put it in the data. What's the like time horizon on that workflow, or like where are the biggest like gaps in that time, or like the biggest lags in that?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. So lobbying occurs on a quarterly basis. Every report that you saw and the reports that you'll see like in any kind of graph online or a news report, that
Hmm.
happens on a quarterly basis. But the thing is, most companies that do lobby tend to work with many different firms. So Facebook, for example, they're working with 35 different lobbying firms right now, separate ones, individual ones on different divisions, different use cases. Some are working on AI, some are working on wearable tech, and then some are working on like stuff that is very interesting and unique that could potentially be alpha generating. For example, the Vision Pro headset was teased in the lobbying filing like about a year and a half ago before it was announced for like wearable eyewear
Hmm.
technology. So that's something that's pretty interesting that comes up. But yeah, to answer your question, so really it just comes down to looking at those reasons and why lobbying occurs. And so I lost track. Can you repeat the last part of the question?
No, I think that the understanding like the gaps in the time, and it makes sense it's on a
Right.
quarterly basis. And then where, there's other elements of, okay, now the data is public, what about on your end? How hard is it for you, or how often are you updating the data to get that latest into your data set?
Yeah. So yeah, going back to that, it's like 35 different clients 35 different lobbying firms at the same time. So you end up seeing the data happen. Like the reporting is supposed to happen within 30 days of the lobbying activity being started. But since you see the companies that tend to lobby work with so many different firms, you often see new activity on a daily basis for certain companies, which makes this data set viable in terms of delivery. We do this delivery every 15 minutes for all of our clients that are looking to do this for investment purposes. So that's the reason why we do it. You see activity every single day, despite the fact that the lobbying is occurring the reports are supposed to occur on a quarterly basis. So if you worked with just one lobbying firm, which is rare, you would just only have 4 activity points throughout the year, with a few different updates and amendments if you're, increasing the scope of work. If, your lobbying contract is 25,000 and then you increase or decrease from 35 to 15,000 based on how many bills that you want to target in Congress. Those are amendments that'll be published in the public sphere. That's what we capture.
Yeah. Perfect. Awesome. Well, we're actually already up on time. We reached the half an hour pretty quickly there. So Neil, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. And to anyone watching at this point, again, we'll send out the recording afterwards, and so you can get a copy of what we just talked through. But yeah, with that, Neil, thank you. That was awesome. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Evan. Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.